Well, amen. If you've got a Bible, we're going to be in John chapter 21 this morning. John chapter 21. Thank you for being here with us this morning. What's so amazing about today, this is our second week officially as a church. We've been doing a lot of things in the months leading up to all of this, but week 2 as a church, and so thank you for being here. We've been in the middle of a sermon series leading up to the launch of a church now the week after called Encounters with Jesus. Today is the last installment of this. Now I'll give a little sneak preview of next week. We're going to start a new series called Here Comes the Church, and I'm really excited to talk about what Jesus' vision was for his church. But before we get there, I wanted to end with this installment of this series because we're about to have an encounter with Peter after the resurrection. And it's an encounter that I wanted to look at because I think it's going to speak to maybe some practical needs of where many of you find yourself this morning, where I find myself at times this morning. And we're going to look at what Jesus does to restore Peter's relationship to himself after Peter had denied him 3 times the night of his crucifixion. Now, before we get there, I want to set us up with this. If you can't tell by my age, I am a product of the 90s. I was raised in the middle of the 90s, which meant Disney movies is what we watched a lot. I was saturated with the likes of Aladdin and Pocahontas and things like that. Now, what I'm about to say should not be controversial. I think the greatest Disney movie of that time period was Lion King. If you have not reenacted the scene of them holding Simba up as a baby in front of your, I guess you have to have kids to do that, but I've reenacted that scene a few times. But there's a lot of great images from that movie coming out of the 90s. But one of the most iconic images of the whole thing is this scene where Simba gets lured into this valley by his evil uncle Scar, and Scar starts this stampede, and you've got this scene of Simba's dad his life getting taken from him tragically. My brother and I reenacted this scene on playgrounds growing up, where he would hang on the edge of a sliding board, and I would come and just stomp his hands down and just throw him down the slide. I don't know why little boys do such things, but it was it left this mark on me, that scene right there. But what we know happens after that is, Simba starts to spiral because though he didn't actually kill his dad, there's a part of him that thinks, I contributed to my dad's state. And so here he was. He was supposed to be the next king of the Pride Land, and what does he do? Well, he runs. Now, he doesn't do horrible things with his life, but he actually just plateaus and fizzles and fades and starts hanging out with the likes of Pumbaa and Timon, eating bugs, doing who knows what. But here's what he knows. He was not living into the identity in which he was called to be, the next king. And because of the biggest mistake in his life, he had settled for just complacency. Not doing bad, but not living up to the potential that he was supposed to be walking in. He needed to be restored. I don't know if you can relate to that in some way. Maybe you've made these promises at one point along the line in your faith journey. You went to a camp as a kid one day where you had this really big heartfelt moment. I'm going all in for this Jesus thing. I got questions, but I'm going all in. I'm going to help a church plant get up and go in. That's a really spiritual thing. I'm going to start telling my family about my faith, and I'm going to do some really bold things. And I'm putting it all out there. Jesus, I'm all for you. I'm never going back to my old way of life. And then what do? You fall back into an addiction. And you're that's not who I'm supposed to be. And then the addiction now picks back up a little bit more. And here you are, you're spiraling back to the person you said I never wanted to be. And I'm not done with Jesus. In fact, I know he still loves me and the cross and the resurrection, all that stuff. But we just settle in this place of complacency. I found myself there in my early 20s, having been raised in church, knowing all the Bible answers in the world, but really just settling, running, if you will, because of the addictions that I had found myself in, the poor decisions I was making. And I really began to ask myself these questions how is a guy like me supposed to do all these great big things, share my faith and lead others to the Lord? How can I do that when I've got all this in my life? Maybe you can relate, again, a little bit yourself. Do you find yourself in that, I'm on this tipping point, I'm not done with Jesus. In fact, I'm here in church this morning. I love the message of Jesus, and yet, I really do some stupid things sometimes. And how could God ever restore me back to my potential? If you have ever found yourself there, this is the encounter that Jesus has with Peter. It's so vital to getting unstuck. One of the things that I've noticed in ministry, I've been in ministry now for 10 years, is that I would be able to look out and see a lot of young men, young women who have the writing on their life of, that's a special person. God has put gifts and talents and competencies in their life. If they ever realize what they're walking with, they could change the world. And yet because of past decisions and past mistakes, they just find themselves settling drifting in and out of church on occasion, kind of losing track. I haven't read my Bible in a few years, and just getting listening to the voice of doubt and the enemy. This encounter this morning needs to be heard for all of us. What is God really like when we make the big mistake? Now, when you read the Bible, this concept of restoration is all throughout the pages of the Bible. The biblical definition of restoration is when God takes something broken and he makes it new. Broken things made new. Webster would take it a little bit more than that. It says the process of receiving something back more than has been lost, such that the final state's greater than the original condition. Now, if you understand the salvation message, the gospel message clearly, that's what it was like when you met Jesus. He took the broken, the sinful, the most shameful parts of your story, and he says, I claim you as my child. When you turned in surrender, salvation was like the doorway you walked into new life. And yet, that was just the doorway to now what the rest of life was. It was the microcosm for our relationship with the Lord. It wasn't just that he restored you, now you never have to come back to me with your shame and doubt. No, it's actually now I'm just on this journey of growth. That was the example, though, of God seeing me in my shame and my guilt, bringing me to himself. And now I go back to him over and over and over as the relationship grows. But the question that kind of keeps us from there is, but what does God really think of me when I make the big mistake? What's the biggest mistake you've ever made? Was it an addiction? Is it still an addiction that you're hiding and hoping that a spouse doesn't find out about, hoping that your friends and families don't know about? What's the thing in your life? Is there a pressure point that kind of keeps you from saying, listen, I'm all in, my chips are on the table? Is there something in your life? What does God think of you when you hit rock bottom? To find the answer to that, we're going to take a look at Peter's life, which is why we're going to be in John chapter 21. I want to give you Peter's profile, though, before we get to the text, so that you understand who it is that we're working with in Peter. If you had to summarize Peter's early life, it would be this. He was faithful, he was loyal, and he was an early adopter. A guy by the name of Simon Sinek has one of the most popular TED Talks that's kind of ever come out, and it's called The Law of Innovations, if you ever want to take a look at that. And he does this whole TED Talk about this is what makes great companies go from just you're one in a group of thousands to now you're the next level company. And he talks about early adopters. There's a 10% of people who the first time the vision is ever cast, they're all in. It was like there was something already happening in their life. That vision aligned with their vision, and so they're just there. They're the 10%. Then there's always 10% who hear it and just is so anti what they stand for. But then there's this middle 80% who just watches which of the 10% wins out. Peter was an early adopter. The very first time he encountered Jesus, he was all in. He was hungry, anticipating. Now, here's what he was before Jesus. He was basically running his family's fishing business out of Galilee. So imagine you're growing up under Roman oppression, and you have no really job stream and revenue because of their rule. And so what do? You kind of just work the family trade. You did what your dad did and what his granddad did before him. And because you're under Roman oppression, all you can do is just kind of keep your head down, be quiet, work the family business. And yet Peter was this guy with I'm ready to go take on a hill, but I'm working the fishing business. There's more to me than that. So the first time Jesus encounters Peter, we'll get two examples. One in John chapter 1, verse 42. The very first time Jesus sees Peter, his brother Andrew brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at Peter and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated Peter, which in the Greek means rock. Hey, you've been running your family's fishing business for a while, but let me tell you this. I see something in you. I'm changing your name. I'm putting a new identity over your life. All that pent-up energy, all this, let's go take a hill. I put that in you. You've got a rock-like personality that, once you get in a room, people are going to follow you. You're a rock. Peter says, yeah, I am a rock. I've been feeling that my whole life. You're the first person to ever call that out of me. And he takes it one step further in Matthew's account. And this is what he says to Peter in Matthew. Now, as Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me. I'm going to make you fishers of men." Listen, you ain't going to have all the answers. You have to know exactly who I am. All I'm telling you is this. Right now, you fishing for fish, but because of what you have in you, you're going to be starting to fish for men. Jesus tapped into this thing that was already happening in Peter. And so Peter, he adopts quickly to the teachings of Jesus. And he's with Jesus every step of the way. Now, Peter's one of these guys that's all heart, no mind. You ever met anybody that's all heart, no mind, talks a big talk, runs all off of energy? Great if you're a middle linebacker. Great if you're into like the outdoors and just do crazy stuff. You don't even think about it. You just go. Not so great when you're trying to lead people. So what Peter constantly would do is kind of get his foot in his mouth. He would just say stuff. And you're like, Peter, you can't say that. You know, just maybe say it differently. This is just kind of how he operated. In fact, maybe one of the more famous things that he says that he ends up regretting is in John 13, where Jesus tells his disciples about what's about to happen to him on the cross. And here's what Peter says. Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus said, well, where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me later. Peter said to him, Lord, why can't I follow you right now? I'll lay down my life for you. Dude, I'd die for you. Like, forget all these other jokers, all these other disciples who love you and all that. I love you more than they love you. I'll lay down my life for you. And he was just constantly making these big claims. And maybe one of the more comical stories of Peter is actually the night they come to arrest Jesus. They're like, his disciples are like taken back, and Peter takes out this sword and tries to stand up for Jesus. I'll die for you. And like, he takes a swing at the high priest, a servant, and all he gets is a lobe. He just gets an earlobe. He's like, dude, how chaotic of a human do you have to be? Where like, you're just swinging for heads and all you're getting is earlobes. Like, this is Peter's MO to a T. Chaos, high energy, big claims. And then he has the biggest fail of his life. See, three times the night that they arrest Jesus, they come to Peter and say, hey, you have that dialect that Jesus' disciple, you are one of his disciples. No, I don't know who he is. And 3 times that night they ask him, you're his disciple. And he finally ends with his old fisherman kind of ways, with his profanity-laced tirade. Man, get out of my face. I don't know him. And then Luke tells us that the 3rd time the rooster crows, he looks up and Jesus is looking to him across the crowd. And he has this moment. I've just failed. All my claims, all of my early adoption, all of these things, I've made a mistake. And he ran and he cried. And then a few days later, he gets word, hey, the tomb's empty. Last week we looked at Mary Magdalene's account with Jesus, and Peter was there. Peter gets word, Jesus is not in the tomb. And he runs, and John kind of threw this joke in last week, if you'll remember, where he said, like, I ran faster than Peter to the tomb and all this, but you almost wonder if now there's like this like hesitancy in his step of like, okay, if the tomb is empty, we were right all along, and I was right there with Jesus, but I also denied him. And so like, if he is alive, am I still in? Do I still belong? Like, I believe in Jesus and all this, but like, am I still qualified to be able to walk with him and help carry this thing out? Am I good relationally with Jesus? Now, here's why this passage is so amazing. After the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts is Luke's continuation of the gospel accounts. 50 days after the resurrection is known as Pentecost, and Peter stands like a champ and in front of thousands of his peers proclaims the gospel with such boldness and confidence that 5,000 people come to a saving faith in Jesus. 50 days later, he was a failure, and now 5,000 folks are responding to the message. What happened? John's the only one of the writers that tells you, here's what happened. And he gives this insider's views. Peter had to be restored. He had to be reminded of, no, this is your identity. This is who I've called you to be. And Peter, it ain't about you. This is who I am. And when you grasp who I am, you'll understand who you are. So before I get to verse 9 of our passage, I want to set out, here's the first 8 verses, just to kind of save us a little bit of time. So Peter tells his buddies, Nathaniel, James, John, and Thomas, hey, let's go fishing. Okay, so there's a lot of splits here, but here's what makes the most sense to me as I study the commentary. Why is Peter going back to fishing? Here's what makes a lot of sense. Because he's hit this rock bottom, I'm no longer qualified, I don't belong. He goes back to the thing that he knows best, which is fishing, right? I guess I ain't cut out to be one of these disciples of Jesus anymore, but at least I know how to fish. That's the best thing I can do. I know how to fish. And so maybe you can relate a little bit. Maybe you've got a fallback hobby. What do you go to when you've hit your rock bottom? What's your coping mechanism? What's the one thing you turn to and say, okay, I'm a failure, but at least I know I do that well. Peter's thing was fishing. I know how to fish. And yet the fishing trip goes horribly because probably God has something to do with this. They fish all day, all night. They catch nothing. And so they wake up early the next morning. They're still on the boat. They haven't caught a single thing. Professional fishermen's my butt, you could say. And so what they do, they look up on the shore, and John says, hey, there's Jesus up on the shore. And Peter's like, there he is. There he is. And so Jesus calls from the shore, maybe comically, I don't know, you read into it how you want. Hey, fellas, throw your nets on the other side. And they're like, throw your nets on the other side. What do you know about? They throw their nets on the other side, and they catch 153 fish. They say, dang it is Jesus. He knows what he's talking about. And so here's what's awesome. In verse 8, right before we get to this verse here, it says, here's what John says. Peter dives into the water and swims to shore. And John's like, the rest of us just rowed the boat to shore. I don't know what Peter's doing. He's swimming, we're rowing. Anyway, here we go. Jesus and Peter are about to have their encounter. I want to read verses 9 through 11 to kind of kickstart us on this interaction. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid. So remember that phrase, charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have now caught. Simon Peter went up, drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there was so many, the nets were not torn. So pause there. What's happening? Jesus calls them to land, and what's waiting for them is a charcoal fire. Jesus has already made the meal for his disciples, which is a big deal we'll talk about. But let's talk about this charcoal fire, if you will. So I did a nerdy thing. I looked up how many times the word fire is in the Bible this week. It's 547. So anytime that comes up in a fun trivia thing, 547 times the word fire is in the Bible. The phrase charcoal fire is only in the Bible one other time, and it's in John 18, the night that Peter denied Jesus. And we'll read this in John 18. Now, the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. And he goes on to betray Jesus. Have you ever been in a place where the smell of something triggers a memory and takes you back to a time and a place? What is Jesus doing? He's recreating a scene from Peter's biggest fail, and he's going to redeem it. But let's talk about that real quick. Why is that? Why do you smell stuff and take you back? Well, because you have this thing called the olfactory nerve of the body, which carries information about smell to the brain, and it runs right past the amygdala of the brain, which is the part that stores emotional memories. That's why you smell things, and it takes you to a place. I was thinking this week, I have this weird memory of a kid. I played a lot of travel baseball growing up. There's something about the smell of like cigarettes and concession stand food that takes me back to I'm a 9-year-old playing at the rec league park. Someone's dad's smoking down the left field line. I can smell the hot dogs over there. I'm like, dude, this is like my childhood right here. Maybe you got that moment of like fresh cut grass takes you somewhere. The smell of the ocean. You walk into a coffee shop, you smell something, and it's like the first date you had with your girl back in the day. All of these things. Disney knows this really well. If you were curious, I have not been to Disney yet since we've moved to Florida, but Disney goes through extraordinary lengths to position their rides around like the stampedes of certain animals and like the vendors of certain carts. And they want you to be able to smell your way through the park because smell and memory is so interconnected. So this is what Jesus is doing. Charcoal fire. You remember the night you betrayed me? You thought you were your biggest fail. Here's a charcoal fire sitting here on the beach. Let's sit down and have a conversation. And here's what Jesus does. The first thing he does is he makes a meal and he says, come and eat with me. So verse 12 of the passage. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples ventured to question him, who are you, knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and he gave it to them and the fish likewise. This is now the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my lambs. And he said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to them, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to them, shepherd my sheep. And he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all these things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, then tend my sheep. So a couple observations from this section. Jesus prepares a meal for Peter. Now, you might be aware of this, but in ancient cultures, to eat a meal with somebody was to essentially say, hey, we're in alignment together. And so again, just off the gate, what Jesus is already doing is, hey, I've made a meal for you. And so in Peter's head, it's like, okay, I know you love me and all these things, but do you actually like me? Yes, I like you. Here's a meal. Here's the evidence that we're good relationally. Before any of the other stuff starts, just know this from the top. We are good relationally, not because of anything that you've done, but because that's how good I am. We're good relationally. Now, he does say this. He does call him Simon, son of John. This is like a mama calling her kid by the full name. James, Stephen, Gilford, we have to talk. You're like, dang it. I was good if you would just call me Jimmy. Mom, like, why'd you have to do the full thing? When you whip out the full name, some serious business is about to happen. Now, you probably noticed in the text 3 times Jesus says, hey, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? 3 times to cancel out the 3 times Peter had denied him. That's one way of looking at it. But to really get under the full depth of what Jesus is doing in this moment, you have to know a little bit of Greek. I don't know a whole lot of Greek, but just enough to know something bigger is at play. When we do marriage counseling with couples, my wife and I usually really want to drive home what this type of love is that we are covenanting to. So because in our language, we talk about love like it's just, we love everything, right? I love my spouse, I love my kids, I love food, I love my dog, and you're like, surely there's different layers of all this. What's happening? Well, it's because in the Greek language, there's at least 3 prominent uses of the word love in the Greek language. There's agape love, which is the covenantal, self-sacrificing, I'm in regardless type of love. There's eros love, which is what we call like erotic or intimate types of love. And there's phileo love. This is friendship love. So they distinguish between the different layers of love. So here's what Jesus does. Do you love me, Peter? He uses the word agape. Are you in? Are you at 100? Do you covenant with me? And then what's Peter's response? Yeah, I love you. But he uses the word phileo. Do you love? Yeah, we're good. We're boys. Are you at 100? Yeah, I'm at like 70. And he asks him again, do you love me? Agape. Yeah, I told you, we're good. Phileo. The 3rd time Jesus asks, he changes the word though. Well, do you phileo me? And Peter weeps. He can't bring himself to say, God, you know me so well. Are you at 100? I'm at 70. Are you at 100? I'm at 70. Are you really at 70? I don't know, God. I just denied you. What do you want me to say right now? You know me better than I know me. And apparently I even at 70. So Jesus says, okay, if you're at 70, let's start there. And he issues these words, just follow me. This was the only call Jesus ever issued his disciples. It was never, have it all together, be in alignment with all of my teachings, do exactly what I do, and then you're at 100. It was, just follow me. From the get-go, follow me. What if I'm only at 50? Follow me. We'll inch you up to 60. What if I'm only at 70? Okay, get back up on the bus. Follow me. The call has always been, follow me. Fix your eyes on me. This is not a call to perfectionism. This is just a call to get up. Pull yourself back up off the ground and look me in the eyes and follow me. And he does this publicly in front of the rest of the disciples. This is the best part about Jesus restoring. It wasn't like Peter can go to the guys later and say, hey, me and Jesus talk later. We're good. And they're like, yeah, right. Does he know what you did? Jesus does this publicly in front of all the disciples. And this is what gives Peter the credibility later on to be one of the biggest leaders that the church has ever known, because the rest of the disciples said, man, this is how Jesus functions. He just looked at a guy that betrayed him, and he still said, you're good. Follow me. So Jesus eats a meal with them. And then in the midst of that section, I don't know if you picked up, the second thing he does is says, hey, this is your role. 3 different times he goes, hey, tend my lamb. Hey, tend my sheep. Listen, go back to when Jesus first called Peter. What did he tell him his role was going to be from the get-go? To fish for men. This was always your role. Go fish for men. Peter, this is what's in you. You're so dynamic, so gifted. You could fish the rest of your life and make a nice living, but there's more in you than that. You're going to be leading some sheep. You're going to be called to lead some lambs. Pick your eyes up, man. There's a world hurting, and I've called you specifically, Peter, to lead these folks. Jesus always referred to people as sheep and lamb. This is not a compliment. I think you know enough about lambs to know that lambs are pretty unimpressive animals. Like, they'll just die feet in front of water from like thirst. You're like, what are you guys doing over there, right? Like, they can't bite hard, they can't run fast, they can't fend themselves off. They got no real protective armor. They're very fragile and very open to attack and tragedy. And so Jesus says, Peter, lift your eyes up. You're fishing. I called you to tend my lamb. That's your calling. Go tend some lamb. There's some people out there that need some shepherding. There's a lot of kids walking around the city that don't have the skill set and the competency to pull themselves up. They need to be led well. There's a lot of single moms out there who are trying their best, but they're vulnerable and open to attack. Go lead them well. There's a lot of dads who are trying to carry the weight of it all, working multiple jobs, trying to provide for a wife and a family. Hey, there's some people who are fragile and hurting and addicted. Those are the lambs and the sheep. Go lead them, Peter. This is my calling. But before you can do that well, you've got to be restored. You've got to see yourself the way I see you. You're good. You're clean. We're relationally right. Now go bring that message to other people, because you can't take people to a place of freedom if you've never experienced it yourself. You can't lead people to a place you've never been. If you want to tend the sheep well, we got to have this conversation to be restored. So he calls him to something more. He said, listen, dude, fishing's great, but there's more in your life than that. And then he does one last thing. He restores him. He calls him to his future. And then he says, hey, now about your future, I got some news for you about your future. Verse 18. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wish. But when you grow old, so notice, Peter, you're going to grow old. You will stretch out your hands and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now, this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, Peter, said to him, Jesus said to him, follow me. Peter, turning around, saw a disciple whom Jesus loved, that would be John, following them, the one who had also leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one that would betray you? So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, what about this guy? Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So let's make this plain for just a second. Hey, I got good news and I got bad news for you, Peter. Good news, you're going to live old. That should be comforting. When you read Acts 12 and Peter is sitting in prison, if you don't know this account, he's sitting in prison like bound in chains, about to be executed the next morning. And what's Peter doing? He's just sleeping. Because when you have God's promises in the back pocket, you can have a good night's sleep. So he's sleeping through the night. He gets delivered from the prison then. So good news, you're going to live a nice old life. Bad news is you're going to die the way that I died. You're going to be crucified. So the church historian Eusebius tells us that Peter was crucified, and he just wanted so badly to not mirror what Jesus' crucifixion was. He said, hey, would you crucify me upside down? Peter died the same type of death that Jesus did. So good news, you're going to live old. Bad news, you're going to be crucified. And so Peter has his moments like, okay, that's cool. Okay. He's like, well, you talked a big talk. You said you would die for me, so you get that chance to die for me. He's like, okay. And then he has the most classic Peter moment. Well, what about John? Like, what's his end going to be like? And so just so you know, John actually gets boiled alive, and the church historians tell us, does not die from that, but gets exiled to an island. So it wasn't like John had the greatest thing, but all that to say, Jesus said, hey, dude, Peter, look at me. Like a little kid going to his parent, like, hey, well, why does my sibling get that, and I don't get this over here? And, well, look at me. It's not your business. Stay in your lane. What's coming for John? I'm working on that. I've just called you to follow me, so you follow me. And I've called you to walk in some freedom, so don't get up in John's business. I got a plan for John. So this beautiful picture of Jesus restoring him, calling him, and then say, hey, here's what your future looks like, is what propels Peter to, again, go do some amazing things down the road. But now there's some application for us out of Jesus' encounter with Peter. And so here's how our application will flow. We'll sit, we'll stand, when we'll run. How's that for some alliteration? Sit, stand, and run. So the first part of the application from the text is to sit secure in your restoration. There is security in knowing whose you are and what the trajectory of your life looks like. There is security in knowing this is my identity, this is my purpose, this is my calling, this is the story of my life. To not have security in that is the explanation for a lot of the unease that maybe you see in folks' life, or maybe even your own life as you do a deep dive into you. What is the story of your life? If you notice, when we baptize here, we tell the story of this is what I was before Jesus, this is my encounter with Jesus, and here's life after Jesus. It's a story of God stepping into a mess, restoring you and calling you to something else. But there's some security in knowing all of those things. But Peter still has this moment of, initially he thought he had messed up too much. I mean, is there a way to outdo God's love? Is there like out-sin it, do too many mistakes till I still earn God's favor? Maybe you can relate. Maybe you're like Peter and you're like, man, I've denied Jesus a lot of times in my life. I have in word and in deed. I've distanced myself from his love and his teachings. I've kind of like just drifted off from church at times in my life. I don't really pray a whole lot. I cling to the words of others rather than the words of Jesus. I don't really know if I'm really that great of a disciple to Jesus. I've got all these contradictions in my life. Am I really cut out to do all of this? And yet here's the reminder that we can sit secure in our restoration. Because what caused Peter to be restored? Did he have to go back and do some more church attendance?
Did he have to sign a document that says, I'm actually back on your team, Jesus? What was Jesus doing? Already sitting on the shore with a meal prepared because it had nothing to do with Peter and everything about Jesus' view towards Peter. Your restoration falls on the blood that I paid for you. The fact that I came through the tomb. It has nothing to do with the fact that, you didn't say a bad word this week or did say some good words this week. Restoration had nothing to do with the house you were raised in, the morals that you have in your life. It has fully to do with Jesus' work on the cross, his resurrection through the tomb, and all we did was we followed. And the same call is still true. Restoration is easy, it's just follow. I take the next step. If I'm at 70, I take the next step. The message of the gospel, as Tim Keller would famously say, a pastor that I really respect greatly, the gospel wasn't just the message that saved you, it is now the message that grows you in the next steps of your life. That message was the doorway in. I'm fully broken and fully loved. That's the message of the gospel. And yet it's also the message that grows me. I am a mess sometimes. I do some crazy stuff, but Jesus still loves me, and he picks me back up, and he says, follow me. If you've never experienced that, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, what do we got to do to become insiders to this group here? Do we have to dress a certain way or talk a certain talk? None of that. The call is still the same. Just follow. Take the next step. Join a community group. Get plugged in on a serve team. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. It's just as simple as, hey, lock your eyes on Jesus and follow him with everything you got. There's a famous singer named Johnny Cash. I think a lot of you know his works of Walk the Line and Ring of Fire. He had a great, great musical career. But he got hooked on drugs and amphetamines. And he's got a whole chapter in his autobiography of the amount of cars that he wrecked while he was on all of these drugs. He essentially torpedoed his career, and he spiraled so deeply that he had this thought, and he found this cave, this deep, dark cave, and he said, I'm going to take a flashlight and just walk to the back of the darkest cave I can find, and when the light goes out, that's the end of Johnny Cash, because this is what shame will do from you when you think you've made too many mistakes. The light went out, and he had this thought cross through his head, and in his words, it was God speaking to him for the first time ever that said, I'm not done with you. Get back up and walk out of the cave. And so he said he fumbled his way through the cave, and standing outside of the cave was his two buddies. He didn't even know how his two buddies found him in this cave, but sure enough that they were. He goes through the rehab process, and in the next few years after that, he began to, change the trajectory of his life around. He began to go on crusades with Billy Graham, singing about a God who could save even a wretch like him. And at the end of his life, MTV was running Johnny Cash's videos of him professing his faith of, hey, the world's a dark, messy place. Apart from Jesus, you can't have hope. But I found Jesus, and I've surrendered my life to him, and you should consider doing the same, because he had the musical clout. MTV gave him the rights to do that. This is what security and restoration looks like. I'm immovable, unshakable because of what the work for Jesus did in my life. So not that you don't just sit in your restoration, you begin to stand upright in your calling. When you sit in a chair, sometimes you hunch those shoulders and roll them over. I had a deep tissue massage a couple weeks ago, and that's what my guy said. He's like, dude, you got some tightness in your shoulders. You kind of sit rounded a little bit. So that's why you got to stop sitting down so much and stand up. When you stand up, you got to start owning some stuff. Say it with your chest, they might say it. Right? So you stand up. Man, I'm secure in how Jesus restored me. Now I'm going to stand up in my calling. Jesus didn't just save you for something, from something. He saved you for something. We're still here on earth being the ambassadors of kingdom, walking all over earth with the representatives of Jesus, and he has placed a calling in your life and my life. The way he looked at Peter and said, hey, tend my lambs, tend my sheep. And there's a calling on your life. The New Testament writers are very open with the fact that, hey, you've got a gift given to you by God. You've got personalities and wirings and giftings and all of these things God has put in you so that you can now utilize for the advancement of his kingdom, that we can really get off the sideline and into the game. It's not we just sit back and say, oh man, the paid professionals got this thing on lockdown. I just kind of live my life and do this thing on Sunday. And so no, God literally put a calling on your life and wired you in such a way that we can now march out and be the church, not just show up at church, but we get to walk this thing out in everyday life. And the coolest thing about being a part of a church is that we organizationally can give you a vision for your calling and what that could look like. But the freedom and the fun in your faith kick in when you realize, man, I've got a vision for my work. I've got a vision for my home. I've got a vision. And like, there ain't no one telling me to do this. Man, this is just my walk with the Lord. He's put some stuff in me. And now I'm just telling everyone I can about him, from my kids to my spouse to my coworkers. Man, and that's the gift that we have. The coolest part about all of this is, even going back to this scene here, is that Jesus it's not like he needs us to do any of this, but yet he chooses to partner with us in this. Like when he called them to shore, he didn't need their fish. He didn't need any of their stuff. The fish were already on the fire. You keep your 153. I don't need the fish. I already got the fish. But if you want the greatest joy in your life, you'll learn how to utilize your gifts for the advancements of his kingdom. That's what it means to be the church. So we sit secure in our restoration. We stand up tall in our calling. And then we run our race. The writers of the New Testament, and really a lot of people talk about life as this race, where we are running this thing out. So Paul does the same thing in his letter of 1 Corinthians. He talks about life being a race. Look what he says in 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that all those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you will win. I love that as a competitor. That there's a race that we're running, and I'm gonna get after this race. Everything I got in this race. This is the viewpoint of living the Christian faith. Because we are disciples of Jesus, we do the things that Jesus did, right? So what did Jesus do? He restored people, and then he called out the potential that he saw in them. Now, as disciples of Jesus, what do we get to do? We get to mirror that in how we do life. We get to, call people to a restored life. Hey, if your marriage isn't great, hey, if this isn't how life is supposed to look for you, I've got hope for you. The message of Jesus, we get to call people to be restored. And then we get to see things in people and call out their potential and their calling. As parents, I think this is one of the greatest gifts you get for your kids. As you watch your kids raise, you can say, man, God made my kids special. I get to call that out of them. And so here, we're disciples of Jesus, bringing restoration, calling things out. But here's what inevitably happens. We do a little bit of what Peter does. We're running this race. And rather than staying in this lane that we're supposed to be running in, what do we start to get to do? We start to look up and around and wonder, man, how come other people's races aren't like my race? You ever ask that question? Sometimes we're like thoroughbreds. I don't know if you know much about horses. They've got this widened vision. They've got this ability to see peripherally, and it does them damage when they're trying to run a race. So what do? They put these blinders on race horses so they stay tunnel vision running in their lane. And this is essentially what this call is, to run your race. It's to put your blinders on. There's times you're going to want to look up and say, man, why is my story different than their story? How come they don't love people like I love people? How come their personality is different than my personality? Man, God called me to give up something over here, but man, I see that folks over there, they still come to church. They haven't given it up yet. Man, I'm reading my Bible every day. Why aren't they reading their Bible every day? I've gone on 2 mission trips last year. I come to church like once a month. What's their story? He leans in and says, run your race. You've got a race. There's a calling in your life. You've been restored. You stay in that lane and run as hard as you can in that direction. Well, what about the other folks? Don't you get to worrying about the other folks. Jesus is all up in their business too, calling, pulling, wooing them to himself. We have this opportunity to run at a speed and a direction and an intentionality when we just get to wrap our minds, man, I have been restored, brought from death to life. And man, now there's these gifts and passions and competencies in me. And because of that, man, he's called me to a city. He's called me for such a time as this. And I would say the same is true for your story. Why did God pull you to this city? Man, why is potentially God calling you to be a part of this church? It's because you bring stuff to the table that others in a room don't. And when you start to run your race and start to tap into the potential that's in you, you're bringing something to a body that the body needs. And so the goal is not to say, why aren't they doing it like I'm doing it? It's actually say, whoa, this is why God called me here. I get to be the piece of the puzzle that's missing here. And while I live that life, I can call other people and raise them up to me at that same standard. There's a joy and a beauty when you've been restored, when you've been called, and you begin to run that race with everything that God has put in you. So, stand, sit secure, stand secure, and then run your race. What an opportunity we have as a young church to have a group full of people who are not paralyzed and stuck from past mistakes, but are walking with a freedom and an infectiousness that the world is longing for. What if we grasp our restoration? What if we stand in our calling? And what if we run with a fervency and a joy that others are looking and say, I want what you got. That's the opportunity in front of us to look at this encounter with Peter and say, that's available for me as well. So here's how we're going to respond this morning is we're going to sing one more worship song. But I'd love to invite you to just, where you're sitting, just to pray, to bow your head, close your eyes. I've got a couple prayer prompts to lead us through. Anytime I read a text of Scripture, man, I'm journaling, I'm writing, and I begin to pray through my notes. And this is what a response time is to pray through all of these things: restoration, calling, and this race that I'm running. And so if you would you close your eyes? And here's maybe just the first thing that I would invite you to pray through. It's the idea of restoration. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you have been restored by Jesus? That would be the first thing to think through. Have you had a moment where you've just turned and looked at Jesus and saying, listen, I'm in. I'm going to take the first step and follow you. And maybe you have had that moment in your life, but you've got this sin, this issue in your life, and you're like, I'm hiding it, I'm burying it, and it's keeping me from being all that I could be. Could you just pray through your restoration issues here just in a couple minutes? Secondly, are you walking confidently in your calling? What has God called you to? As you look at yourself and you think of your competencies, the things that bring you joy in life, are you utilizing that calling for the sake of His glory? This is just a chance to put all of those things on the altar, if you will, and say, God, these are some things you've put in my life. They're yours. Take them, bless them, magnify them. Would you start praying through the callings that God has put in your life? Finally, are you running your race with joy? Is joy a marker of your life right now? When you just examine, are you locked? Are you just held down by comparison? Are you looking around at other people in your profession? There's just no joy in your life. You're looking at family members. There's no joy. This is a chance to say, just God, I want to run this race with joy because this is what you've called me to. Are you running your race with joy? Lord, thank you that you're always sitting, waiting with the meal prepared, and the invitation is just to follow. Thank you for that just that being your heart, your nature, that we don't have to earn, we don't have to rework, but that you love us despite our biggest messes, and you just call us to follow. Lord, thank you for placing callings and giftings in our life. Lord, would you take them and use them? Even in our body right now, we need the different gifts to start coming out and serving the body. Lord, would you fill us with joy that we would run this race? Lord, in a city and in a world that looks around and compares and wonders, why can't my life look like theirs? Lord, just give us a joy and a confidence, Lord, that this is what you've called us to, and we're going to run wide open. So would you fill us with joy? It's in Jesus' name.